Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. If you've ever gone to the Renaissance Fair, you noticed they have a lot of parades. There's a morning parade, an afternoon parade, the Queen's Parade, etc. And by and large, they're pretty much the same. There's the poor people in front and the Queen in the back waving her hand. Except one time when my guest decided to throw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. I'm talking, of course, about my good friend, Don Taylor. Hello, Don.
Dan, hi Dan.
But before we get to how you raised the flag of rebellion at the Renaissance Fair, let me ask you the first Fair Folk at Work question, which is, who is the person who said to you, there's this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
It's kind of a threefold answer. I first visited the fair as a customer when I was in high school. My friend Mark Lucero, who is one of those fantastic kind of artistic hippie kind of guys, and he told me that he thought I would love it. And in retrospect, I think it was really just that I had a car, but we went and it was fantastic. But I also have this memory of it being really overwhelming for those of us who listen to these things who have worked at a fair. When you work there, you see how the moving parts work. You know when the parades are coming through. You know the shows that are on which stages. You learn the ways to get through the crowds to get to the faster places. But as a customer for the first time, being like 16 years old, there was a lot of chaos. Everywhere you turned, there was just something happening, plus crowds of people. I just knew that I loved it. At one point, the Queen's procession came through and they stopped at one of their scheduled stops. And I was there with my best friend from high school. And I said to her just slightly too loudly at an unfortunately quiet time, she had syphilis. I really enjoyed it. And I told my mother about it. And my mother was a nurse in outpatient dermatology at UCLA Medical Center. And they did a lot of work with patients with psoriasis. And somebody, to this day, I have no idea who this was. I owe him my whole experience at Fair. He was a patient and he told my mom that he worked at the Renaissance Fair. And my mother said, "Oh, my daughter went to that and she really liked it." And he told her she should come out and come to workshops and maybe she might want to work there and it'd be great. And she said, "Oh, and he said it's so much fun. And at night, that after the customers are gone, there's camping and people walk around in the dark and they have parties and people play guitars." That was my mom's whole thing. It's like, oh my God, if she only knew. I was like, okay. And then the following year, later that year, the LA Times, they ran a full page ad for participants and talking about workshops and what the dates were and showing you a little map of how to find it. And so I went, and that was my first experience of being there as a participant,
Let me
which,
go backwards in time before we go forward in time.
sure.
Describe Dawn getting into the car before she went to the fair.
Before she went to the fair, she was pretty much your standard high school theater kid. I was very outgoing, very sort of obnoxiously extroverted, I think, to cover up the fact that I had horrible self esteem. I was a teenager, basically. I don't think being a customer at Fair really changed that much, but becoming a participant, and as the years went on of doing that, it formed my personality a lot. It was incredible for my self esteem. I learned things about performance. I made friends that I still have to this day. My closest friends are people that I met 40 years ago at the Renaissance Fair.
Let me just ask, did you have any high school or pre-fair theatrical triumphs?
I've always been terrible at auditioning. I get terrified of auditioning. But the high school I went to, Aviation High School in Redondo Beach, California, which was called that not because we studied aviation, because it was on Aviation Boulevard. A couple of years before I started there, they had built this fantastic auditorium. So you see like 1,500 people. We had flies and we had catwalks and we had a whole backstage workshop area to build sets. And it was fantastic. I was in a couple of productions, but I really wasn't nothing really to speak of. But my junior year, it was decided that we would try doing a play in the round. And me having just by dint of having been there long enough, I got to direct it. And that was the effect of gamma rays on Man in the Moon Miracles. And I discovered an incredible love for just the whole process, not just being an actor, but just the creation of a thing. In the summer, we did original musicals. We had this band teacher who was like this huge musical nerd. So we did parody songs for our musicals. The first one of those I wrote, it was based on a very old, in the public domain play about Dracula that we rewrote and turned into a musical. And I wrote a song to the tune of House of the Rising Sun about them seeing Carfax, the Castle Carfax up on the hill. Following a summer, we took another public domain play about Robin Hood and turned it into a musical. And I directed that and actually wrote a couple of the songs for that. And so those were basically the theatrical highlight of my high school career.
Well, theater in the round translates very nicely street theater at the fair, right?
No, it wasn't. But also, I mean, I had done improv, but I'd never done like street theater improv, which is completely different. And so, yeah, so that was a whole process that I learned about not just cheating out to the audience, but how to cheat when the audience is all the way around you, how to keep moving so that you're looking into. And I had kind of figured some of that stuff out directing the play in the round. But when you're a performer in the moment and there's so much noise and dust and people eating things and you're trying to keep attention, it's a very different set of skills.
And you picked some of this stuff up at workshops?
I did, but I was also really lucky in that first year workshops, I had no idea what I was going to do. I took the classes and the fair BFA stuff, but I didn't know what I was going to do. And every morning they'd say, join a guild and they'll help. My first attempt at that just sort of stumbled across the mongers. And I was like, okay, they like yell at people and they would stand around and they try to sell things. I could probably do that. And I went to their thing and somebody was having a middle of the week get together at their house. And they were going to work on costumes and talk about things. And all were invited. I said, okay. So I went to that and didn't know a single person there. And there were Monger people. There were also some people who were from court and they were working on costumes. One thing was like just listening to all of them, there was a lot of talk about their characters and their backstories and all of the things that their characters had done with each other. And none of it seemed really appealing. And I went to fair the weekend after that. I was with my best friend because she was going to workshops too. And she talked to this fellow who I can't even remember what he was running, a game or he had something going on. If you were interested in trying out, he had a form to fill out with your name and address and emergency contact, and then this little paragraph about your character. All I knew at that point was what I had heard the mongers and the court people talking about. So I took that thing home with me and I wrote this elaborate biography of like woman and this village and my father did this and I one child but three had been born stillborn and I was saying, I mean, it was just insane. So we went and we brought our things back and she got a job with him and I did not. And later I realized it's because he probably thought I was crazy. He read this thing. It was like, oh, just get it. All he wanted was like, I'm a peasant and I like food. And instead he got like the entire first book of Bridgerton or something. So he just thought I was insane.
Do you remember what the booth was?
I really don't. But I do remember that what happened was that at the morning meeting the day after that or something, I was standing around, still completely unsure of what I was going to do, and standing with my friend Eileen. And this fabulously beautiful, large-breasted woman came running up to us with this smile that lit up the skies. And she said, "Do you guys have a gig?" And they're like, "No." "You want to be camp followers?" And I was like, "Sure. What does that do?" And that was Virginia Veneroso. It was the Halberdiers. And I stumbled into, in that moment, working with you and Mark Sullen and Springhorn and Adam Long and Matt Silver. I mean, all of these people that were fantastic. Like, well, they're like the King's Guards, but it wasn't just the King's Guards. It was this,
Keystone Cops of the Fair kind of thing.
yeah, like hippie street theater, Keystone Cops of the Fair thing. Learned how to work a crowd. I learned timing. I learned what's funny and what isn't, basically from working with all of you guys. That was my school for being funny.
I can think of no greater way to be introduced to the fair than being through the halberdiers. It was just in a way so pure. You just went out in the streets and you did stuff. Like I could think of something just driving from Woodland Hills to the fair. And then an hour later, I was doing it in front of an audience. And there'd be another clump of people in 5 minutes. I didn't learn till much later how hard it is to find an audience that's willing to play. And this is one of the themes of this podcast, is that the Pattersons provided this playground with some very loose guidelines on what you could do. And then we were just unleashed on the streets. What I got out of it was you had to wear a hat. Don't let your wristwatch show.
Oh, you can't wear purple.
And you can't wear purple, and black is bad.
I couldn't master a passable fair accent by their standards to save my life, but I would just speak to people in this like half-assed Irish brogue, and it passed. It was fine. That was enough.
Half-assed Irish plus pirate. Agari, that to be a good thing I see there on the street before me here.
You're not talking like all the other people in Los Angeles, so you're a character.
I was happy if I was heard.
To this day, one of the funniest things I ever saw anyone do was while we were in Halberdiers. There was this bit. We didn't have a lot of regular bits, but there was the one where every day we went past the court glade and sang Happy Natal Day to Lord Burleigh. And he hated it. And he was, go away. And I remember when that bit first started, he was very gracious about it. And then as time went on, kind of became apparent that it really was annoying him. But he was still playing along, and just, why don't you pick someone else once in a while to do your stupid song to? And Adam Long was 15 at the time. And he had this nasty, disgusting, filthy, stuffed dog with a rope around its neck that he dragged around in the dirt behind him. That was his prop. We had always been told that, you should have a green umbrella, was the phrase, or everybody should have some kind of a prop or a funny hat or something that's very specific to your character. Adam's at that time was this dog. He would have it, and Adam would often be like up at the front, singing as loud as he could, as close as he could to Lord Burleigh. This one day, he finally just snapped and told us all to just get out and to leave, and he never wanted to see us again. And he put his finger in Adam's face and said, I especially don't want to see you, and I don't want to see that dog again. I never want to see that damn dog. So that was a Sunday. So the following Saturday, we came and we went and we did the exact same thing again. And Adam had the dog, except now the dog had this French collar ruff around his neck. And Burleigh got up and he said, I thought I told you I never wanted to see that dog again. And Adam said, oh, this isn't the same dog. This is his cousin. from France. And he was 15 years old and he comes up with this bit.
It helps if you have a mental image of a 15-year-old Adam in Agora facing off with a huge guy dressed in black, that he actually did comply with his request. You know, the one of the Halberdiers bits I always liked, if you're walking down the street or even in a show or something, somebody saw a person taking a picture with their camera, and then someone would shout Flemish portrait device, and immediately whatever was doing was
Oh,
dropped, and everybody did poses for this do one tableau after the other.
yes, I remember that.
But one of the things I remember about it that I even recognized at the time was that people were not necessarily shoving each other out of the way to get in the front, but they were actually looking at each other and creating sort of like living paintings type of
Mhm.
things.
But also,
Completely.
that's the reason why it was so much funnier. I mean,
Yes.
anybody can do that. Get out of my way, shoving your face and thing, and that is amusing. But the idea of somebody yelling, somebody picks up paper, and then 12 people just snap into a position with each one of them in some kind of a frozen artistic pose. That's funny. Well, I know that we, the camp follower girls, we had a bit that Virginia let us in that when the Celts would do their march along, if they came along the way we were, everybody got out of the way because you're supposed to get out of the way. But we, the ladies, would lay on the ground and look up their kilts. And until I guess we were asked to stop because they didn't like it, it was making them uncomfortable.
I think that was kind of the point of what we were. I mean, I wasn't going to talk about Peasants for Peace yet, but I suppose that's a nice natural segue into it.
We could.
Um,
My memory of this, I have had two different people talk to me about this recently, and my memory of it is a little bit different. So I don't know if my
this is
version.
the magic of oral history. The way I interpret it, it was sometime out at Devore where there was a lake,
Yeah.
and somebody had discovered a cannon, and they had given some, I would assume like an SCA jerk, the right to explode the cannon. It was like every 15 minutes, and it
I
was
think it was like pirate guys who had a boat they took
so
with
they
them.
would circle around in the lake and they'd shoot their cannon off. And it was incredibly disruptive. At the fair, you have the sounds of the parades, the mongers, the bands, I mean, the dancers. It's a noisy place. But every time they would shoot off the cannon, it would stop everything at fair. And there was no rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the fair had a sort of hippie, pacifistic background, and that warmongering was not a popular topic around the campfires. And this was the time of the no nukes demonstrations in Europe. So
Well, it was also, remembering correctly, this was also around, we were involved in some kind of a foreign war at the time, too, like either in Iran or it was like the Falklands had just happened or
maybe it
something.
was
So,
Falklands, yeah.
because that was all on our minds as well.
And so to have the peaceful glen of Chipping Under Oakwood reminded of the outside wars going on was just genuinely annoying. And the fact that it was continually being thrust in our face kind of thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, there was the Queen's procession, which is preceded by a bunch of peasants waving their garlands and skipping in. And then the next thing I know is they're all lying down and you are petitioning the Queen up on her chair, something about,
Oh, not even remotely. Okay, here's what I remember.
okay,
You and I, there was a period you had lunch every day while I was in between my shows. And I always found it very amusing. You brought a brown sack packed lunch with you every
yes.
day to fair. And there was this like hill that you would sit on, you'd eat your lunch. So I would go and I would like hang out with you while you ate your sack lunch. After one of those lunches, we went walking down the hill and we were headed in the general direction of the main stage. When the Queen's show was on, the Queen's Guards with their muskets and whatnot would stand in a line off to the right and up and kind of behind the stage, but separate from the show that was going on. And they would wait until the show was over and then go back. And you and I were walking by there one day. And I think the cannon went off as we were approaching. And we started riffing on no war and war is bad. And I approached one of the guards and I beseeched him to lay down his arms and to no longer support this horrible slaughter that is going. These poor guys, they were like about 18 or 19 years old. And their whole job is just to walk holding a musket or a pike. And so you started saying something too. And so then the next day, we went there on purpose when they were standing there. And we gathered some flowers and I like put flowers in their guns. And I was asking them to lay down their arms and to join us in peace. And then it was the following weekend. And that was when Adam Long got involved. And because he was Adam, he says, hey, this will be fun. And now he's got like 10 other people with him, mostly adorable little girls who were like mooning over him. And so Adam joined. And I think it was the second day when I laid down in the road. And I think you might have laid down too. I don't know. But I do remember I laid down in the road in front of them like I was like Tiananmen Square or something like that. But I got up before they had to do their thing. So I didn't stop them from their deal. But yeah, the following weekend, Adam was there. And Adam was the one who got everyone to, we all lay down in the road. And Adam was the one who started everyone singing, all we are saying is giveth peace a chance. Following day, we were told not to do that anymore because Jan said that it was an unauthorized improv, which is a phrase that you don't hear very often.
Well, the only thing I can add to that, I think before Yanni Todd gave his decree of unauthorized improv, he was behind main stage beside himself. I think I said, they did have peasant rebellions and he looked at me and he said, no, they didn't. I said, yeah, peasants didn't like to be put in the army and then shipped off to the New World and get killed. And then he said, but did they ever protest in front of the Queen by lying down? And to my everlasting chagrin, I had to say, no, I was not aware of any time the peasants lay down in front of the Queen at a springtime fair. But we actually went back and forth on the historical antecedents of peasants.
I don't think they had watermelon fights or sold Dr. Pepper at their ale stands either, but those have been okay.
But when I said there were not peasants laying down in front of the Queen, he had this look of, aha, now I can forbid it.
Honestly, in retrospect, it was smart of him to nip it in the bud when he did, because we were close enough to the stage where the Queen show was going on that if it had started drawing any kind of a crowd, we would have been taken focus from the main event and whatnot. And when it's you and me, yeah, it's one thing. When it's you and me and like one other guy, that's fine. Now there's Adam Long and he's making up songs and
And looking back now, we had a hair trigger on getting upset about things, which in retrospect really wasn't that upsetting. I don't know if you were part of the fair female community that insisted upon showing bare shoulders.
Yes.
Or having a button, a discrete button on their costume. But given all the freedom we had and the fact it was their fair.
Yeah, they were giving us all these tools to play with, and they had very few rules.
Our sense of outrage, I think, was inflated, but also it's their fair. And
Yeah.
it's sort of their call on what.
I think it's a matter of we had so much freedom within the parameters of they wanted us to do so they could maintain their tax exempt status that any time the boot would come down about anything, it just felt like we were being oppressed. I was okay with like, okay, I've got to wear my shirt covering my shoulders. I hated the institution of the women have to have their hair covered at all times thing because first of all, I just did not feel like I looked at all attractive that way. And also it just was another layer of hot, something else to get sweaty at that point. But really being there at night as well. It was this big, dark, yeah, sandbox to run around and play in. There would be certain weekends, like 3-day weekend, when people who indulge in psychedelics would do psychedelics. And you'd be running around and then we'd see security and somebody would interview, go, oh, security. And then someone else would say, they're not actual cops. They don't care. Do you have your pass? That's all they care about. Do you have your pass? The freedom, both as a performer and then just as an idiot having fun. We had an amazing opportunity to have fun, to take risks, to meet people and try out different parts of our personalities and to fall in love and get our hearts broken and in a completely safe environment where we knew we were surrounded by people who were supportive and that nothing truly bad would probably happen to us. I mean, literally, the worst thing that could happen would be every once in a while someone would wake up with a snake in their tent.
One of, again, my themes of this podcast in finding what the Patterson set up is to contrast the sort of bottom up bubble of creativity versus a Disneyland top down, sort of everybody's a robot. But at the fair, it was a weird process of everybody just selecting kind of what they wanted to do.
And learning from each other
Right.
too. Particularly when, this started in the 70s and continued. I did fair continuously for 17 years. There was a very specific kind of fearless performance that you learn to do. Because, like you said, if a bit doesn't work, it's like, okay, there's going to be another group of turkey leg eating strangers along in 3 minutes, do something else, refine it, see what's not working. And also that playing with the crowd. As far as performance goes, there is a bit of danger to that. I think it's why stand up comics like doing crowd work so much because you don't know what you're going to get back and you have to work with that. So I liked doing shows on stage. I especially liked the fact that they would allow us to write our own stupid plays. But it was the fearlessness that you learned. Fair was great because if you weren't fearless in that way, you didn't have to do that sort of thing. You could always, work at a booth. You could work at a food stand, in costuming. There are so many different things for people to do depending on your personality. But for those of us who really love performing, that opportunity to just spend these 10-hour days in the sun, often having no idea what the next thing would be, or start talking to somebody and you have no idea if they're going to play along, if they're not going to play along, if they're going to give you something that's funny, if they're going to give you something that you can make fun of and their friends will laugh at them and then they have to just deal with it. But that infected the stage shows too, because all of us did a little bit of ad libbing here and there. But for me, some of the most fun stuff doing stage show was working with the interpreters. The interpreters liked it when we included them in the bits. And the audience loved that kind of thing. Even if it wasn't always entirely spontaneous, it would feel spontaneous to the audience. And they loved that stuff.
Have you ever been in a place outside of fair where you have used that fair fearlessness to sort of power you through?
Yeah. I think particularly when I got into journalism. Much like my first days at Bear, it took a long time figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I went to culinary school and I worked as a chef for a while and realized that that was not an environment I wanted to be in. And then I was working as a barista when I made a friend who was a customer. And for various reasons, he found himself needing someone to write some stuff for this community newspaper that he was editing. And I said, I can write. So I started writing for him, and that led to more work with the newspaper and then a full-time position with them. And I was the person that wrote the stuff that wasn't hard news. I typed up the calendar things. I had to come up with the feature stories. Sometimes it would be a guy had an amateur wrestling ring that he hired out. Sometimes there was a kid who had won some national piano competition and I had to go interview him, and he was very good at the piano and very bad at talking, and his father ended up answering most of the questions for him, and I had to turn that into a story. But I found I was good at interviewing people about their lives, and I think a lot of it was because of those skills that I learned at Fair. One thing I learned was when I showed up for the interview, if I was having a problem with my recorder or I had been having some problems with my car or something's going on, I would immediately share that with them. And if I came off as a little bumbling, it would put them at ease, because when people hear a woman is coming to interview them for a newspaper story, they're feeling pressure. And then I show up and I'm like, oh, hey, this button isn't working. And it would put them at ease. But I also learned how to phrase a question, how to listen, all improv stuff, how to listen to their answer while at the same time formulating where that will go next and waiting for the right moment to say my thing, or waiting for when I should let a silence drag out and then they will feel the need to continue talking. And all of those are essentially performative skills. And after that, I was working as a film critic, and one of my jobs was for the local newspaper here in Portland, Portland Tribune. And so in my job as film critic, I would occasionally get invited to do radio shows and to talk about what the hot movies were, or my Oscar picks, or whatever it was. And I think because of all my years with Fair, it was easy for me to pick up the rhythm of how the radio people did the stuff that they did. The listening while thinking, while creating, and knowing how much time I have for the segment. And so making sure that my answers are concise. And so one of the guys I did that with was a big local radio person. I became a regular on his show. And then after he left, we put together back-to-back podcasts that we did Monday through Friday. We did 4 hours every day of live. It was essentially the same as being on the radio. And one was called Legion of News, where I would collect a bunch of news stories and I would read them, and then we'd talk about them and we'd riff back and forth on them. And then the other was just kind of a regular, his old radio show with segments and things like that. But I think all of the skills I had doing that, I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had all of those years of the improv training from Fair. And also the fearlessness. I've never experienced stage fright. I will be nervous before a job interview. I will be completely tongue-tied around people that I want to impress, and I don't think I'm good enough. And then all of a sudden, everything I say is like, duh, I like pancakes.
Well, let's get back to you at Fair, feeling fearless. What were some of the bits that you came up with?
I had a bit that I came up with when I was about 19, because I wasn't old enough to buy beer and I was poor. So the problem being, of course, how do I get beer? And at this point, having worked at Fair for a couple of years, and I have never been a girly girl. I have never been one to use my feminine wiles, because I never really thought I had any, honestly. So it was one thing that I did. I would see a fellow with a beer, and I would always make sure he had a couple of his buddies with him, because this is one of the things that we learn, is that people will go along with just about anything to be a good sport in front of their friends. And so I was like, hey, and I would have two rocks, cheap prop. And I was like, oh, you want to see a magic trick? And they're like, sure, because they're like, oh, the little peasant girl's going to show us somebody. I'm like, okay, here's it. Okay, you have to take a rock in each hand. And I'd start to hand that. Okay, here, I can hold that. And then he'd hand me his beer. And I said, okay, take a rock in each hand. Now close your eyes really tight. And then I'd start chugging the beer. And after a few seconds, the guy, nothing else would happen. I wouldn't say anything. His friends would undoubtedly start laughing. He would open his eyes and go, hey! And I'd hand him his spirits and say, got you again, or whatever, and then just scamper off. I only ever made a guy angry once. And I think it's like those beers were expensive. Really kind of a jerk thing for me to be doing. But,
you did it with a smile.
I did it. And, it's like, and he had a story. He had a story for later.
One of the things I like about being sort of one-on-one, or one with just a few people on the street, is the sense that Mark and myself and these other people, we created something that perhaps they will never forget. And I've asked this question of David and Theo and Billy Scudder and all that kind of thing. Do you as a performer have a different sense when you make sort of a connection with one person or a couple of people chugging their beer and then running off, versus standing in front of 600 people and getting a laugh and a response? Does that feel the same thing to you?
No. Oh no, they're very different. They're absolutely different. I actually dated a man for a while that I met at Fair. He was a customer. He came over to my house a month or so later, and I had a friend there, and we started talking the three about Fair. He lived in the Valley, and he'd been going to Fair as a customer, and we talked about how there had been a bit that we used to do as part of How the Dear Ladies stuff that involved Virginia like picking one of us, and we had to find a husband for one of the girls and do all the things we need to do, gather a crowd around us, and then we'd like pick on some guys out of the crowd to come and play with them a bit and decide if we thought they would make good husbands or whatever it was. And he said, that was me once. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah, no, it was me once. I can't remember. It wasn't you, but I remember the girl, she kissed me. She was a really good kisser. But it was like this big memory for him. To me, he was just like one of any number of people we had brought in to this improv when we did it. But to him, no, this was like a moment he had, where he was part of the show. And so it was like this super happy memory he had there. On the other hand, doing a show on a stage, I've always had this thing where whatever I'm doing, if I'm performing and it's just going out to like faceless people, whether it's like a podcast or it was stage thing at Fair or something, once I'm off stage, I think I'm invisible. I don't exist for them anymore. And so it would be weird when we started doing our plays at Fair, and I'd be walking around with Tracy and Paula. We had a few people that would come see our show over and over again. And this woman and her son, they came up to us and they're saying, oh, you're the girls from that play. And they looked at Paula and said, you're the girl in the dog suit. Like she was this celebrity. I started to get an idea of how surreal it must be to be actually famous. Here's someone that, to your mind, you have never laid eyes on, but they know you, and they're really excited to meet you. Yeah, I've had instances where I was on the phone with somebody in a customer service thing, and they recognized my voice. I was at a comic convention here in Portland, and somebody came up to me and heard me talking to someone and said, are you Don Taylor? And I was like, yeah. Like, are you a process server? But it's just like, oh, I listen to your podcast. I'm like, could I get a picture with you? And I'm like, okay. It is a very different kind of performance. Because when you're doing the improv in the street with the customers, it's like you said, you're making a thing with them. They are part of the gig. And when you're performing, they're just watching you and they may appreciate what you do. But yeah, the interpersonal thing is very, very different. I've always wondered, after all of those years of doing fair, I've always wondered how many people have pictures of me in
Yes,
photo albums or hanging in their hallway or something.
I'm going to try a few quote unquote role plays.
Oh boy. Okay.
Say it's fair and you're in the back and it's around 10:15 in the morning. So it's still kind of cool. There's nobody really had filtered that far back. And you're just, striding down the street. There's a family of four sort of wandering up. The girl is about 10. She's wearing a brand new garland. She's sort of dressed in what her mom is obviously thinks. It's like a granny dress, you've seen it 100 times. The boy is like 7. He has on his new Robin Hood hat, and the girl sees you and immediately stops her mom by grabbing her leg. What do you do?
I guess that would be one of those situations where you would curtsy, you'd go down into the oh, my fair lady, it is so wondrous to see you here this day. Are you a princess?
She sort of smiles, keeps hugging her mom's leg, and she nods, yes, she's a princess.
And say, oh, I am so honored to be in the presence of such a wondrous and beautiful princess this day. Is this gentleman your guard? Is he protecting you from ruffians?
He waves his wooden sword at you.
Oh no, no, sir. I mean no harm. I mean no trespass. Please, please, beg you, spare me my life.
She starts giggling, and her mom says, go ahead and speak to her, honey. And she says, that's my brother.
Oh, you must be very proud to have such a gallant knight as a brother. And your garland, your headdress, your crown is so beautiful. Are you
She's
wearing
sort
this
of like,
special for this spring day?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Say, are you wearing it special for this spring day? I was always terrible at this crap, by the way. So it's
You're
like
doing you're doing
thank you.
exactly right.
Yay.
Not that there's a right or wrong way.
I
Which
like children. Fair was such a great place for kids to get those experiences. I mean, I think we've all seen there's a video of a little girl at fair and she's black and she's all dressed up as a princess and she gets to approach the queen and the queen asks if she is a princess from Wakanda. And she says that yes, indeed she is. And the way this little girl glows for being part of this and being taken seriously. It's the yes and of the improv with fair is that you go into it treating each encounter like this person is important. And I think that makes it special for them, no matter what age they are, really.
and I would bet dollars to donuts there's that garland is on a wall someplace from that time she was at fair and she was called the princess. And I think that's something that sort of came from the Pattersons. And they were from a theater movement in the early 60s, which basically no one can fail. Everyone is part of the show and you're here to have fun. And how such a basic ethos was introduced in the 60s in a canyon off of Hollywood Boulevard and is still being done 70 years later is like a testament to what the Pattersons and Judy Corey, her women shows of just drawing people up. And it wasn't to insult them, but it was to include them.
We had all kinds of audiences up and down. And how sometimes the audience is really on and that audience energy is huge. And sometimes, for whatever reason, the weather or sometimes it's just not working. And I don't know. I was just very tired once. and and our audience was just giving us nothing back. And at one point we had done we'd been through like this little passage that was a surefire let. It always worked and nothing from them. And I turned and I was just like, And I just stepped forward and I was like, this is funny stuff. And after, I can't even remember everything I said, but after the show, Paula very politely said to me, I have a note. Maybe in the future, don't yell at the audience for not laughing. I was like, yeah, that's a good note. You're right. I have two things on this topic. The first is that we were invited to do our little 3-person show at this fair in Long Beach. And we went, and it was in a man-made park surrounded by office buildings with a freeway next to it. So the concrete paths and the perfect lawns, and then skyscrapers looking at that. They built some stages. And, our little Chaucer's tale, jumping up and down and running around doing everything. We had a show each of the 2 days on 3 different stages. The first was at 10 a.m., which was right about a half an hour after they opened, all the way at the very back. So no one had actually gotten back there yet. Our second show of the day was on a little postage stamp size stage that had obviously been designed for like a musical act or something. It was like 6 feet by 6 feet. And it was right in front of a chain link fence with the freeway running behind it. Then our last show of the day was on the biggest stage they had. And again, we are not, it's like the 4 of us jumping up and down and saying our little rhyming. We haven't blocked this for a stage that big. And so it was a nightmare. It was also in the path of the airport.
Mhm.
So that in the middle of the show, a low flying airplane would come through, drowning everything out. And Tracy started just yelling, incoming! And we hit the deck until the plane was gone. And then we continued. The other thing I was thinking is that the pre-show warm-up stuff was not something that we'd really thought about or had planned much of until there was one stage at Devore that there was a hilly rise between the stage area and the road that people would walk by. So they couldn't actually see the stage from the road. So you had to figure out a way to get an audience there before you could start the show. And so we started doing the thing, just ripping stuff off from you, like we pretty much did with all of our shows. But the laughter and applause practiced. It's like, okay, we want those people to know there's a show going on here. So now something really exciting just happened. Yay! Getting people to scream and get attention. Tracy and I started doing a terrible mind reader act where she would be on the stage, and I would say that we have an amazing connection between our minds that we have built through years of working together. She will put on this blindfold. It's like, can you see anything? No, she can't see it. Say, I will go into the audience and give me an item, and Tracy will know just through the power of our minds what the item is. And so then it was just this stupid riff on the stupid mind reader where a guy would give me his watch and I'd write, all right, Tracy, I have an item. Says, it's coming. It's like, take your time, just ticking away. I take the guy's shoe and just bad shoe puns and things until she guessed what the thing was. But it was terrible. But audiences found it hilarious, and it managed to. The laughter would pull people in, so we could actually start the show with more than 3 people sitting there.
I think I have a list of questions here, believe it or not.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Okay, you've never owned a booth, so I'll skip that series.
I did base myself out of Drench-O-Inch for a number of years. And so even after I didn't really want to kiss strangers anymore, I would hawk in front, and I still got like my own personal space in the back, which was fantastic. It's nice to have a place to go hide away from people.
What was your chant that you would regale the masses with? Do you remember?
I don't really remember per se. We had some regular things that we said. I have heard from a number of people, though, that it was apparently very memorable one gloomy, overcast day when the crowd was really lethargic and not getting into anything. And I was standing on this hay bale and I was just hawking my heart out, and nobody was paying attention. And so I said, I have a family of Puerto Ricans living in my underwear. And so I,
I'm sorry. Did you then try to
as I
connect?
recall, that got like no real response either. Like some guy looked up like, what? I must have heard that wrong, and just kept walking. It was like, it was one of those days when literally you could say anything and you're just background noise to these people. And so it
But did
didn't
you
matter.
try to tie the Puerto Ricans in your underwear to kissing a girl by throwing a
I was
punch at
literally
her?
just trying to see if anyone would respond to me to make sure that I wasn't like a ghost at that point. I just,
The glory of the fair is that thought could enter your mind, and 2 seconds later, it was in the world.
out of your mouth into the world, just doing the thing. But yeah, I did work at Drench and Wench as a kisser a few years. And then I personally hit a wall where I just couldn't handle another strange drunk guy's mouth on mine again. But I made myself useful in other ways.
Letting people know the contents of your underwear.
There was a woman who had a bit that she used to do that I loved so much. It involved a banana, and she would create a competition of who could fit the most banana into their mouth. And so she would get like two or three people of different genders and hand out the bananas, peel the bananas, and then bite into it a little with their teeth, and then she'd measure them to see who did the most. And then she would top it off, standing up on a hay bale, completely peeling a banana and throwing her head back and just doing a total sword swallower bit, closing her mouth around it and then pulling it back out intact. And it was this perfect combination of carnival and a little bit racy, but not too racy for the kids, and audience participation. And I always really admired that so much that it had all the parts.
What do you consider the parts of a good improv then?
I think when you have something that can include the audience, because once you include anyone that is dressed in street clothes, all the people there who are also in street clothes now feel they're part of it too, because that is one of them.
And you also know that if you pulled up a member of family, at least you have a crowd of that family that's not going to walk away.
Right. If you have like a mom and a dad and at least one kid, if you do something involving the dad, the kid will be delighted. Kids love to see adults brought down off of that throne of authority, but to see a parent, particularly, the father figure, is especially delightful to a child.
Can I
But
interrupt once again?
yeah,
I think it actually goes both ways. That not only does the kid see their parent being brought down a peg, but they're also seeing a different side of their parent in that they're seeing their parent playing
yeah,
like a kid. And
yeah,
so it's suddenly not junior and dad. It's just like, look at dad play.
yeah. And so I think then if the basic concept of whatever it is something that is easy to get across in an area that is crowded and loud and busy, that once you've got their attention, your concept has to be simple, but it should be simple in a way that's open-ended. And like you talked about working with Mark, if you know what your clothes should be, because otherwise these things can just go on forever. So you need a goal that you want to get to. So the fun is that middle part of like how you're going to get to that goal.
What else?
you don't want to make anyone feel bad. You want them to walk away, even if there's a prank-like aspect to it. Everybody has to leave feeling good about the encounter.
I would like to do another what if or improv with you.
Okay.
You
What's
are
hard?
you and now.
Okay.
You're at Thanksgiving and your little niece, Zoe, age 14, pipes up and says, I'm going to do the Renaissance Fair this year, just like Aunt Dawn did. And I want to get the stories that she always tells us. Your sister, we'll call her Amy, looks to you and says, Yes, Aunt Dawn, tell me why I should let the light of my life, for whom I almost died giving birth to, tell me why she should go to the Renaissance Fair. And you say,
This is a hard question because is this me today now in modern times, or is this
Yes,
me in the bit now? I would say that I say that's fantastic that you want to do the Renaissance Fair. It's a lot of fun and there's a lot of ways to be creative. And I would ask the mother, have you been? What I would end up doing would be I would pull the mother aside privately and I would say, if you're not going to be there on site all weekend, make sure that you have an adult who is familiar with fair that you trust and that you trust to keep an eye on your kid. Because I know that there was a huge amount of freedom when we were there. And there was kind of this unspoken community around the fair kids where people kept an eye out on each other's kids and kids ran around that fair like maniacs and had an enormous amount of freedom, but because their parents knew that they were safe and they knew people at different booths who knew the kids, and so there were all these adults who knew who they were. You want to know what the fair culture is where they're getting involved, because there are a lot of Renaissance fairs now in a lot of different places. Texas Renaissance Fair, I had no idea it was as big as it is. Sound and Fury, their version of Reduced Shakespeare, have their own dedicated 1,000 seat theater. That's how big the Texas Renaissance Fair is. So I think our fair, there was sort of a very familial culture about it. And working at a booth, and some child you've never seen before shows up, you're like, hey, hi, you're talking to me. Like, whose kid is this? And so you go, oh, that's so and so. And she's down at the steak at a steak place. Yeah, okay. We know whose kid this is. All right, fine. It was this kind of keeping an eye on things, sort of a culture.
um, to switch gears here quite a bit, actually. Do you remember the first time you saw a lady only dressed in chainmail and a guy wearing a bathroom shag rug across his crotch?
I do indeed.
Do you remember what your thought was?
My thought about stuff like that, say there was a woman who would come regularly and her boyfriend or husband, whoever was on, had a collar and she had a leash. Things like that. My thought about things like that was always like, how nice this is that they have a place to go where they're not treated like a freak. You're a place where you can be this. Like, we had the guy who was there like practically every day dressed as Superman. But I mean, we got a lot of really interesting people there, but it's like here in Oregon, there's a thing called the Oregon Country Fair. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to the early days of Renaissance Fair in Agora. It's dusty, it's hot, there's jugglers, there's stuff going on. But it's that sort of environment where people know that they can go publicly with things that they'll either be looked askance at or might actually even get them beaten up if they do it in normal mixed company. And again, it's that safe playground idea.
I'm going to give you a counterfactual.
Okay.
Imagine a world that has no Renaissance fair. How would your life have played out?
Fair was not only responsible for a large amount of who I am as a creative person, but it also colored and formed my social interactions, my self-esteem, my sexuality. I mean, all of the things that we got to do as performers, the opportunity to try things, the opportunity to take risks. Those are also things that it was a safe place to do interpersonally as well. So I don't know. I know that I'm a very different person than my parents were. And there was a lot of chafing at societal conventions for me growing up. These ideas of this is how I was supposed to act, this is how I was supposed to behave, this is what I was supposed to want. When I discovered fair, I discovered that it was okay to be those things and to want those things and to have that kind of fun. And there were other people like me who wanted to do those things as well.
Can
So
I
I don't,
interrupt you for a sec?
sure.
As it became apparent you were spending a lot of time at fair, one, were mom and dad happy and pleased? And two, what do you think they thought your career path would be?
My dad left when I was 15, so he was never around for any of my fair years. My mom only barely understood it. She came out as a customer a couple of times, but she only barely understood it. She saw it as more of my, my drama thing. She grew up in a much harder time socially. She grew up poor and had to work for a young age to survive, basically. And, there was a war and there, all kinds of things that I didn't grow up with. So her concern was that I needed more responsible adult goals to be able to take care of myself and to be a fully functioning adult as I grew. And the only things that I felt a native interest in were things like art and theater. And she saw those as frivolous. As those are all well and good, to play at and to enjoy, but you need to learn to type, that kind of thing. So she never really understood it, but she never really understood what I was doing there or what I was getting out of it anyway. Um,
Do you want me to give you one of my last questions?
sure.
When you were kind enough to say, sure, was your next thought, I have to remember to talk about who or such and such. So this is your opportunity to give me any miscellaneous thought
Uh,
went across your brain.
well, I mentioned halberdiers right off the top, and they were huge for me. And it's been interesting Facebook bringing me together with people that I hadn't talked to for a long time, like Matt Silberstein and Patrick O'Bannon. And so that's been really cool. And there have been people who were very important to me at different points in my life that I have lost that connection with, but I still think of them incredibly fondly. Laura McLean, for example, we were really close friends for a short time, and then we kind of went in different directions. But I still think of her with an enormous amount of love. She introduced me to the book Princess Bride. I had read some of his other books, thrillers, but I had never read The Princess Bride. And she's like, I have this fantastic book that I think you would love. And this was before the movie came out. And she was right. I love two things that I always associate with Laura was that. And she told me once that I think it was her uncle or something who told her, don't be a pebble, be the wave. And we would always sort of laugh about that, but that's been something that's popped up in my head quite a lot over the years.
When I interviewed her, she mentioned that you heckled John Davidson.
Oh, yeah, I did.
She
Yeah.
didn't remember what the heckle was or what was his transgression. Do you remember why you were?
One year he had purchased castle boot and he wore this monk's robe, but still with the perfect John Davidson hair. And he would stand out there in the road and try to get people to come into the booth and to do stuff. And he just sort of cracked me up because his hair was just this perfect, unmoving, hairsprayed helmet. And then he had these monk's robes on. And he wasn't attempting to do any kind of voice, or he was just John Davidson standing in the street in a monk's robe, which cracked me up. And so I would just occasionally yell things at him like, "Your hair is perfect." Yeah, that was one of them. One time I yelled at him, "The girl with something extra was genius," which was a TV show he did that lasted like one season. I think it, Sally Field played his wife. She had ESP, and it was sort of this cheap ass ripoff of Bewitched or something, where he's a normal guy and his wife has ESP. So yeah, that was. And after I yelled that girl with something extra thing at him, he actually he turned, he looked at me, and he actually had a little bit of, it looked like hurt in his eyes. And then I felt bad. And then I didn't ever yell anything at him again because it hadn't occurred to me I could hurt his feelings.
Well, Laura still remembers doing that with fondness. And I think she also said maybe in retrospect, it wasn't the kindest thing we could have done.
It was not nice. It was not a very nice thing. And I mean, we all have regrets. We all learn to be better people as we grow.
I think that's a nice ending point. So let me push the stop recording button, which is actually very close to the start recording button.
Mistakes have been made.
Mistakes have been made, but let me demonstrate my recording prowess by using the right menu choice. And that was my May 2024 interview with Don Taylor. If you have messages that you'd like to pass on to Don, you can send them to me to forward to her at djng@earthlink.net. If you have questions or comments about the podcast itself, you can send them to me at djng@earthlink.net. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest at Fair Folk at Work, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. See you later. Bye-bye.